Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Fraud Definitions Workgroup and Community Interest Group webinar. My name is Megan Musgrave from the Payments Industry Relations team, and I will be your moderator. Joining me today are Andre Sapella, Assistant Vice President of Secure Payments, Tim Boyk, Vice President of Payments Industry Relations, Connie Thine, Senior Vice President of Payments Industry Relations, and Ken Montgomery, First Vice President and COO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, as well as the Payment Security Strategy Leader for the Federal Reserve System. Before we go ahead and get started, I'd just like to make folks aware of a few quick logistics notes. The participant lines for this call will be on mute due to the high number of RSVPs. As a result, all questions may be submitted electronically using the Ask Question button. And this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to our website, fedpaymentsimprovement.org, within the next few days. Now that I've gone over the logistics, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Ken so he can get us started.
Well, thank you, everyone, for joining today's webinar. We're excited to tell you more about the Federal Reserve's new Fraud Definitions Workgroup. For years, the Federal Reserve has worked to reduce payments fraud risk and advance the safety, security, and resiliency of the U.S. payment system. We see value in collaborating with the industry to help develop a more consistent and holistic view of terminology used to describe payments fraud in the United States. Through industry meetings and dialogue, we've socialized the approach of forming a small and nimble work group to improve ACH, wire, and check fraud definitions. During these engagements, the positive feedback we received from stakeholders indicated strong industry support for this type of work. Previously, our payments improvement work groups, such as the Secure Payments Task Force or Governance Framework Formation Team, were led by industry participants, with the Federal Reserve acting as a facilitator. The Fraud Definitions Work Group will instead be Fed-led in collaboration with the industry. Thus, any deliverables produced by this group will be published by the Federal Reserve rather than the collective industry participants. In our role as a leader catalyst in payments, the Fed will lead this group of industry representatives with specific expertise to improve the quality and consistency of data related to ACH, wire, and check fraud, which in turn may help enable more effective, efficient, and timely data collection and cross-industry communication on payment fraud trends. During today's webinar, you will hear more about why this group is being formed, the desired outcomes and objectives we hope to achieve, and the various opportunities for industry engagement throughout these efforts. So with that as an introduction, I will turn it over to Andres to tell you more about the Fraud Definitions Work Group approach and objectives. Andres?
Thank you, Ken. Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to update all of you on the Fed's fraud definitions effort and the related industry work group. Before I get started, just a brief reminder that you may submit any questions you may have through the webinar interface so we can address as many as we can at the end of the different segments as well as at the end of the presentation. Now, in the next slide, let me describe to you what we see as the opportunity for this work. As you can see, we have some challenges and opportunities. In 2018, the Federal Reserve commissioned secondary research that identified inconsistencies in the classification and reporting of payments fraud data from study to study. This research also noted a significant lag between the reporting period and when study results became available to the industry. As you all are probably familiar, fraud measurement involves complex ecosystem of industry participants and various services, technologies, and operations. Each time some unique information needs, each one of them having some unique information needs and perspectives. Also, payments industry participants tend to classify, track, and report fraud at levels and in a manner necessary to conduct and sustain profitable, competitive, and compliant business operations. In other words, fraud classification and communication is more internally focused to support and inform the needs of their business. Finally, as we continue to observe, the payments industry is steadily evolving the use of ACH, wire, and check payments for innovative and faster payment methods. While in parallel, payments fraud also rapidly and continually evolves to capitalize on new exploits. ACH and wire payments are exposed to innovative and rapidly evolving origination endpoint risks, where security is more challenging to control. Therefore, it is necessary to consistently classify this information in order to analyze, communicate, and mitigate fraud effectively. The opportunity in front of us through this collaborative effort will yield several benefits in the form of improved fraud information quality and consistency, starting with ACH, wire, and check payments. We can gain an enhanced understanding of evolving fraud trends through a more consistent classification of fraud incidents, which in turn can lead to more effective collaboration in sharing fraud risk information, enabling more timely awareness and mitigation. In this regard, the Fed initiated this fraud definitions project expected to run for a period of 9 to 12 months and be driven in a collaborative manner with the industry. The next slide provides a conceptual example of how consistent classification of payments fraud can enable more timely access to more complete and accurate fraud information for all of us in the industry. As you can interpret from this conceptual example, there's value in mapping varied fraud definitions in use today, represented on the left side of the slide, to a consistent classification model as shown on the right side of this example. Insights from aggregate payments fraud information enable improved communication, collaboration, and mitigation within our respective organizations as well as across industry stakeholders. It is important to note here that this is a conceptual example, and the ultimate structure, including the breakdown and levels of classification, will be determined through the hard work the Fed will lead in collaboration with the industry work group participants, with opportunities for feedback by the broader industry. Therefore, let me shift gears now towards the work group itself and how we're actively planning industry engagement in this effort. On this next slide, related to the fraud definitions work group, again, I will stress that the work group's focus is on ACH, wire, and check fraud, and will be comprised of Fed and industry participants who bring their respective expertise in these payment types and related fraud analysis and mitigation skills. It is anticipated that the work group will produce 2 deliverables, both intended to help the industry align on a more consistent, holistic view of payments fraud in the U.S. First, the work group will deliver a recommended fraud classification model that includes detailed definitions and/or categories to better understand key data points in payments fraud, enable mapping and analysis of ACH, wire, and check fraud use cases through consistent categorization, and promote a shared understanding of payments for the fraud industry. For the payments fraud, I should say, for the industry. Secondly, the group will deliver a recommended roadmap that encourages broad industry adoption of this model over time and to capitalize on the incremental value we expect it will add to payments fraud communication, collaboration, and mitigation. At this time, it's also important to note that these deliverables, the fraud classification model and the related adoption roadmap, will be recommendations only. There's no intent by the Fed to mandate use through legislation or standards. As you will hear from Tim later, our effort to form the fraud definitions work group for ACH, wire, and check is well underway, and we encourage all of you and your organizations to express interest in participating. Now, this next slide will help you better understand what it means to participate in the work group over the course of the effort. Workgroup members should expect to commit the time necessary to actively and consistently engage in this effort throughout its duration, again, 9 to 12 months. The workgroup will be comprised of industry participants selected by the Fed who have in-depth expertise that includes, but is not limited to, fraud prevention, payments risk mitigation, and ACH, wire, and check operations. As noted here, there's an expectation that the workgroup members will need to spend time contributing to the work effort on a weekly or biweekly basis. There's also planned in-person meetings. You can see for reference our estimated duration and effort commitment on the bottom half of the slide. I look forward to engaging with you in this work going forward through the work group or through various other industry communication interaction mechanisms that Tim will address in the next segment. But let me pause here to see if there are questions that we can address at this time. Otherwise, we will have some dedicated Q&A time at the end.
Hi, Andre. So we do have one question thus far. How will these efforts differ from private sector organizations working to research and describe fraud?
Thank you, Megan. That's a great question. The Fed does not intend to work on this effort independent of other efforts ongoing by the industry. And we are taking a look across the industry in terms of similar efforts to understand objectives and align our efforts in a collaborative manner to move the work forward.
I think another piece of this is, as part of our outreach, we are looking to understand what other organizations are working on fraud activities like NACHA and others in the industry. That collaboration will continue so that we can leverage and communicate the work that's going on across those organizations and across the industry.
Are there other questions?
I'll just give folks one more minute to submit a question before we move on to Tim. All right, so another question came through. Will the Fed mandate these fraud definitions as industry standards?
No. The intent here is to produce a recommended fraud classification model that enables consistent use of definitions, but there is no intent to mandate adoption through legislation or other means.
All right, and we do have one more question for you. Why is credit card fraud left out of this process?
The starting point for this work, through some dialogue with the industry leading up to this point, indicated that the greatest need, again, based on the secondary research as well as those conversations, is to focus on ACH, wire, and check. The idea is to build this model with those three payment types as a starting point and then evolve from there.
All right, I'll give folks one more minute to push through any other questions. Otherwise, we'll move on to Tim. All right. I'm not seeing any pops through. So, Tim, I think we can go ahead and get started with your section next.
Great. Thank you, Megan. I have the honor to lead some great people with outreach responsibilities here at the Federal Reserve. And my staff and I have been working side by side with Ken and Andres for months now, socializing this opportunity with the industry, and we're really excited to get some things kicked off. As we do so, we want the industry to be aware of the process and criteria for identifying working group participants, as well as the value of the community interest group we've created to keep professionals informed and involved. To reiterate Ken's earlier comments, transparency and inclusion were at the forefront of all our planning efforts to get this work initiative kicked off. And as I talked to in several slides, you will note we're taking steps to ensure those two guiding principles are met. So turning to slide 9, many of you participating on the call today are existing members of our broader Fed Payments Improvement community and already received notifications and updates on many of the varying Fed initiatives in play today. In all, we are nearing 5,000 subscribers, and we couldn't be happier with the community's enthusiasm and participation levels. For the Fraud Definitions Initiative, we plan to leverage this broader community and have already set up an interest group specific to this project's effort. Approximately 200 people from the larger FPI community have already agreed to be part of the Fraud Definitions Community Interest Group, and that number continues to grow daily. Being a member of this community interest group has its advantages. Specifically, this group will receive regular updates on working group progress, but also have the opportunity to provide feedback on the working group's direction and focus. We're excited about the launch of the community interest group approach, and we feel this is an excellent way to keep the industry engaged and aware while also facilitating the necessary feedback loop. As far as the working group, slide 10 dives a bit deeper into Andres's previous point on the working group scope, level of activity, and desired commitment we seek. I wanted to quickly talk about the working group's desired construct. First, in terms of size, our goal is to keep the working group nimble and efficient. From our experience with past working groups and committees across all payments initiatives, effectiveness in terms of speed and execution generally suggests we attempt to keep the numbers manageable. That said, even though our slide suggests an approximate range of 20 to 30 working group participants, if we receive an overwhelming response of diverse, well-qualified candidates having expertise across numerous functional areas, that range could fluctuate either way, and we will be sure to adjust appropriately to ensure the working group has the best opportunity to succeed. So what are we looking for? We're really trying to ensure we account for working group representation across two main axes. First, we're seeking broad segment representation and are encouraging FIs, both banks and credit unions, business end users, ACH, wire, check operators, core platform, technology, risk intelligence, and analytics providers to consider their involvement. And second, we want to blend segment representation with the appropriate functional expertise across the 5 main areas on this slide, beginning with fraud governance. These are the people with a background of developing an overarching fraud management strategy, establishing an organization's fraud loss and risk tolerance, and have expertise advising executive management on compliance, financial risk, and mitigation strategies. Fraud operations and strategy, we're looking for candidates here with experience interpreting, gathering, and compiling fraud data while managing the execution of fraud and risk prevention strategies defined by the governance group. We're also looking for pure ACH, wire, and check operational experts. These are the people familiar with channel operational procedures and process flows for handling and routing identified fraud or flagged transactions. These are also people with knowledge on payment channel customer service protocol. On the fraud systems technology side, these people are more architectural in nature and understand the connection points between, say, a bank or credit union's core DDA platform and the fraud directories it possesses or partners with from a third party. And finally, in terms of those said third parties, we're looking for representation from fraud risk intelligence and analytics providers, namely those with expertise in fraud direction and reporting. So it's easy to express your interest to be involved in either the working group or the community interest group. On the next slide, slide 11, it provides you with the website location for navigating to the proper area. You simply go to the Fed Payments Improvement webpage and fill out the appropriate online survey form. It's a very straightforward process, and the page is easy to navigate. I encourage you to bookmark this site since it's a great location to visit when looking for information related to any of the Fed payment improvement initiatives. As we turn to slide 12, again, both Ken and I mentioned earlier the importance the Fed places on transparency and inclusion and how the community interest group helps us achieve these critical work components. Joining the community interest group will ensure you're being informed of the working group's progress, but also facilitates the response loop I just mentioned earlier. As far as selection of working group members, those not selected to participate on the working group will automatically be placed in the community interest group and will be afforded the same opportunity to be kept informed and provide input. And as always, in addition to keeping the community interest group informed, we encourage you to approach a Fed official at one of the upcoming numerous conferences we'll be either attending or presenting at this year and engage us in healthy dialogue if you have the time. So to wrap up with designated next steps on slide 13, I'll reiterate that the deadline to submit your expression of interest to be involved in the working group is Valentine's Day, February 14th. After the close date, the Fed will take a look at the broader pool of candidates to ensure we have the diverse industry representation and subject matter expertise we seek. We anticipate the final decisioning process and notification to chosen working group participants to finish up in the mid-March timeframe. And as far as joining the community interest group, people can join anytime by simply updating your existing community profile or creating a new one if you haven't done so already. If you have any specific questions after this webinar and want to direct them to us, the email box listed on the bottom of the page is continuously monitored, and I encourage you to provide your thoughts or ask any questions. Turning to slide 14, I'll turn it back over to Megan, and she can help us facilitate any questions that the audience may have. Megan?
Hi, Tim. Yes, we did get a few questions while you were presenting. So the first one is for you. Is there any federal government participation on this work group?
Yeah, great question. Yes, and actually, yes, there is. With the Fed being an operator in this space for ACH check and wire, it was appropriate that we have representation from our product offices to participate. So yes, we are planning to have representation from the various Federal Reserve organizations.
All right, and kind of a similar question. Oh, I'm sorry, was someone else going to jump in there?
So in addition to the Federal Reserve participation, we will expect that hopefully the Treasury and other organizations that who are large users, originators into the payment system, that will get them involved in those activities. There have been some conversations, as you may imagine, between the Fed and some of the Treasury components on these particular activities, so we would hope that would continue, and they likewise would participate in the work group.
All right, thank you. Tim, another question for you. Do you anticipate including forum perspectives in the work group?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that again, Megan?
Of course. Do you anticipate including foreign perspectives in the work group?
Right now, we are limiting our scope to just national U.S.-focused perspectives, but we will remain aware of some of the activities that are going on in other countries. So that is our approach to this point.
Great. All right, Andres, a few questions for you. The first one, why did you choose to focus on ACH wire and check-type frauds for this effort?
Thanks, Megan. The Fed chose ACH check and wire first for the reason that Ken mentioned earlier. As an operator, we have a vested interest in understanding a complete, accurate, and timely view of payments fraud in this space. But secondly, there was an equal level of interest from the industry through various dialogues leading up to this point, as well as the secondary research I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that indicates that when it comes to ACH in particular and wire as well, there may be gaps in the data and opportunities for a more consistent classification of fraud payments in that space, or payments fraud in that space. So those variables contributed to the decision to focus the scope initially on ACH check and wire.
All right, we have another question for you, Andres. What is the scope of work for check? For example, will it include paper check and electronic check images processed by banks and other intermediaries?
At this point, we've determined that it's important to be inclusive of every aspect of check payments. So these examples will be part of the dialogue and the effort to classify those in a consistent manner as well.
All right. Tim, we have a few more questions for you. The first one, where do you expect these in-person meetings to occur? Do you have any dates confirmed yet for these meetings as well?
Yeah, good question. And I'd love to tell everybody it would be Hawaii, but I don't think that would be applicable here. So I think we need to look at the construct of the working group and determine, where the people are coming from. Clearly, within each Fed district, the Fed has buildings in which we could maybe host some of these meetings. So I anticipate the Fed hosting these types of meetings, but at this point, the location of these meetings would be to be determined, but certainly try to make it as easy as possible and convenient for everybody.
All right. Second question for you as well, Tim. When you talk of industry, do you include companies making and receiving payments as well as financial institutions and other intermediaries?
Yeah, great point. Certainly, we are very much interested in business and user perspectives. They are a key component to coming up with and trying to identify some of the root cause of fraud. So we absolutely have very much an interest in looking at business and user perspective.
Right, that was the last question. I'll pause here for 30 seconds and see if any more come through. All right, Andres, we have a question for you. What are the emerging risks that the Fed sees as the greatest concerns prior to the working group commencing?
Thank you, Megan. I think it's important to recognize, as I mentioned in one of the slides, that there's an evolving use of the ACH rails, if you would, and there's a need to focus on the various new endpoints that originate payments. So the focus initially in terms of greater risk concern might be in those points of origination and the fact that they're less well controlled. In addition to that, there's probably folks on the line are familiar with some of the discussions in the industry around business email compromise and the use of that technique to drive origination of payments through fraudulent emails or misrepresentation of the originator. Those are a couple of areas, but really the benefit of this work group and having the broader industry involvement will be to gain insights and perspective on what all the concerns are and how to best consistently catalog them and classify them in the model.
All right. Thank you, Andres. Tim, we have one more question for you. How did the Fed determine the number of work group participants for this effort?
Yeah, great question. So I think I mentioned earlier in the slide, we have quite a bit of experience interacting and interacting with working groups, forming working groups, and identifying the optimal numbers in which we want to proceed with a working group. So some of those working groups have a tendency to be rather large, and some of those were maybe more based on general industry-driven types of activities, whereas some of the working groups, I think we need to really kind of roll up our sleeves and kind of get our hands dirty and dive into topics with a smaller segment of time in which we want to try to achieve some goals. So with that said, we've looked back at what the optimal numbers are for some of the working groups that we've facilitated, and that's where we kind of settled into that 20 to 30 type person range. And we feel that number, along with the subject matter expertise and the segment representation that we're looking for, we think that number is, kind of the range that we're looking for, and it would be optimal for our working efforts.
Great. Thank you, Tim. Andres, we have a question that just came through for you. Is the Chicago Federal Reserve Bank running point on this effort, or is there another Federal Reserve branch or the board leading?
So this effort is a cross-system effort. Therefore, there is no one branch per se driving the work. It's a collaborative effort across the Fed and with the industry.
All right, great, thank you. So with that, we have no more questions that came through. So Ken, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you so you can close us out.
Thank you. So our objective today was to provide you a high-level overview of the work we wanted to do relative to this particular effort involving the Fed's efforts on secure payments. There are other work activities, if you go out to fedpaymentsimprovement.org, that you'll see that we're undertaking, again, in the vein of improving security of the payment system. Our hope is that through the conversation today, we piqued your interest in basically getting involved in the work activities that we've defined here and participating either on the work group or in the larger Fed payment improvement community. As Tim mentioned, if you've got follow-up questions that you would like to talk to us about, please feel free to do that. But I would encourage you, as I've said, to look to see if this is something that you would like to participate and get involved in these activities. You know, something that I would like to likewise stress is that we really have a commitment to being transparent, collaborative, and inclusive on these activities. So as we're undertaking these work efforts, we will be looking for mechanisms to share information, to share minutes of meetings that we're having on these activities. Those that have an interest can keep informed and up to date on where our activities are coming with all of that. So appreciate your time today. Again, would make the offer. If you have follow-up questions, follow the contact information we have with there, and then continue to check back in terms of the work activities we have. As Andre and Tim both indicated, you know, we have the submission form for expressions of interest available on the website. We're hoping to have all of that wrapped up in terms of completing that selection and communication process and then kicking off our first meeting in the March timeframe. So with that, thank you for your participation today and look forward to speaking to you on this topic in the future. Thank you.